My dear friends, come sit with me for a while. Imagine us in a cozy kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee in the air, maybe a loaf of bread still warm from the oven sitting on the counter. That's the kind of place I want to take you to tonight. Because sometimes the stories we're telling don't come from faraway castles or glossy magazines. They come from ordinary families, from the houses where secrets linger in the walls and love collides with betrayal in ways that shape generations. Now, have you ever heard of something called a secret inheritance? Most of us know inheritance as numbers on paper. Deeds to property, maybe a family trust meant to make life easier for the ones who come after. But what about the parts of inheritance that don't show up in the estate planning documents? The hidden assets nobody talks about? The old house that wasn't listed in the will, but carried the weight of history? Or the family loyalty that gets tested when betrayal creeps in? This story is about all of that, wrapped up in one family's life. And no, it's not about millionaires or the pages of a gossip column. It's about people who could just as well be your neighbors or mine. Our story begins with Margaret Collins, a 72-year-old widow from Ohio, a woman with soft hands that still carry the memory of chalk dust because she'd spent her life teaching children their first words, their first numbers. After her husband died, she thought her purpose would fade too, but she still had one anchor left in life, her only son, David. David had grown into a man of ambition. He worked with computers out in Seattle, the kind of job where you never really explain what you do because most folks wouldn't understand the jargon. He had a wife, Rachel, sharp as a tack and organized in every way Margaret wasn't. Together, they had 2 children, bright, lively kids who loved their grandmother's stories more than their bedtime cartoons. Margaret loved them fiercely. She sold the old farmhouse where she and her late husband had lived, taking only what she needed. With a portion of that money, she helped David and Rachel buy a bigger home in Seattle, a second house compared to their small starter one. It wasn't written down in some flashy inheritance drama. It was just what mothers do when they believe in their children's future. And here's where the first family's secret slipped into place, like a loose floorboard under the rug. Because while everyone knew Margaret had sold her home, not everyone knew what she held back. Hidden away in a quiet bank box was a deed to another property, a little cabin on the edge of Lake Erie. A hidden house, if you will. She had inherited it years earlier from her own aunt, a stern woman with secrets of her own. Margaret had never told David about it. Maybe she thought it didn't matter. Maybe she wanted to hold on to something that was hers alone after giving so much away. Life rolled on. Holidays came and went. Margaret cooked Thanksgiving turkeys big enough to feed an army, even though there were only 5 of them at the table. At Christmas, she knitted scarves that nobody really wore, but everyone accepted with polite smiles. She poured her love into small things, because sometimes that's how mothers and widows measure their worth. Loaves of bread, pies cooling on the counter, gifts wrapped in shaky handwriting. But beneath all the warmth, tension grew. Rachel had her own ideas about family inheritance. She saw Margaret not as a woman who had already given so much, but as an obligation tied to the family trust. In quiet conversations with David, she questioned why Margaret still lived alone, why she needed her own independence, why she clung to a house no one visited anymore. Margaret, of course, heard the whispers when she wasn't supposed to. She wasn't deaf to betrayal, even when it came wrapped in polite smiles. And this, my dear friends, is where our mountain climbing begins. Because family stories are never flat. They rise with joy and sink with heartache. Tonight, we will climb that mountain together. From the base of small secrets to the dizzying peak of confrontation and surprising inheritance drama that turned one widow's quiet life into a lesson for everyone who hears it. So take a sip of your coffee, maybe grab a cookie if you've got one nearby, and let me tell you how Margaret's hidden house, her second inheritance, and the secrets buried in her family trust changed everything. As time went on, Margaret's life in Seattle took on a quiet rhythm. She wasn't the type to demand attention. She found her peace in routine. Morning walks in the neighborhood, a pot of soup simmering on the stove in the afternoon, evenings spent reading by the lamplight. But beneath that calm exterior, the undercurrent of tension with Rachel was always there. Rachel, you see, was practical to the point of being cold. She believed in estate planning the way some people believe in religion. Everything documented, categorized, tied neatly with a bow. She was the one who brought up family trust at the dinner table, talking about protecting assets and avoiding probate, as though these were ordinary words for children to hear while passing mashed potatoes. David, caught in between, often nodded along, though his eyes flickered toward his mother with a hint of guilt. He remembered what Margaret had given him, the financial lift that helped him and Rachel buy their second house, the endless hours of unpaid babysitting, the stability of knowing someone always had their back. But he was also a husband, and Rachel's voice was sharp, persuasive, insistent. One evening, over coffee in that very kitchen Margaret had warmed with her pies and bread, Rachel leaned across the table and said, "It doesn't make sense for you to hold on to that little cabin, Margaret. Property inheritance should be streamlined. Everything should be part of family trust for the kids' future." Margaret nearly dropped her spoon. The cabin? She hadn't spoken a word about it. Not to Rachel, not even to David. The hidden house on Lake Erie had been her private retreat, a secret inheritance passed down from her aunt, a stern woman who never married, never had children, and left Margaret the only tangible legacy of her life. "How do you know about the cabin?" Margaret asked quietly, her heart pounding. Rachel didn't flinch. "We found the deed in some old papers. It's not listed in your will. If something happened to you, it could create a mess. Don't you think it's better to include it in the estate planning now, to avoid inheritance drama later?" The word stung. Inheritance drama. That's exactly what Margaret wanted to avoid, which was why she kept the cabin separate in the first place. It wasn't a piece of real estate to her. It was memory, history, a slice of herself. David tried to smooth things over, as always. "Mom, Rachel's just saying we should think about the future. You know, hidden assets can complicate things. If the kids are going to benefit, shouldn't everything be clear?" But to Margaret, it felt like betrayal. She had given so much, her savings, her trust, her loyalty. And now the one thing she had kept for herself, a quiet piece of her heart, was being eyed like another line item in an inheritance ledger. For days afterward, Margaret walked around with the weight of that conversation pressing on her chest. In her small bedroom, she opened the box that held the deed to the cabin. She traced her fingers over the yellowed paper, remembering summers spent on that porch overlooking the lake, the creak of the wooden boards under her bare feet, the smell of pine drifting in through the open windows. The cabin wasn't just property. It was her second house, yes, but it was also her soul's retreat. She thought about her aunt, who had once told her, "This place isn't about money, Maggie. It's about belonging. When the world gets too loud, you'll need somewhere quiet to hear yourself again." Now, decades later, those words rang in her ears. And Margaret realized that Rachel's obsession with estate secrets and family trust wasn't about protection. It was about control. The tension spilled over one Sunday afternoon. Margaret had made her famous chicken pot pie, the kind that filled the house with the smell of butter and rosemary. The grandchildren dug in happily, their cheeks flushed with warmth. But Rachel pushed her plate aside, her voice clipped. "Margaret, we need to finalize the documents this week. The lawyer is waiting. We can't leave hidden assets out in the open." David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The children stopped chewing, sensing the storm. Margaret took a deep breath. Her voice shook, but it was steady enough to be heard. "That cabin isn't a hidden asset. It's my inheritance, my history. Not everything needs to be folded into your spreadsheets, Rachel." Rachel's face hardened. "If you care about family loyalty, you'll do the right thing. Otherwise, you're just creating trouble for all of us." And there it was, the betrayal laid bare at the dinner table. The grandchildren stared, wide-eyed. David looked between his mother and his wife, torn but silent. Later that night, Margaret sat alone in the kitchen. The laughter of the children echoed faintly from upstairs. She stirred a cup of tea she never drank, watching the steam curl into the air. Her thoughts churned. Family betrayal doesn't always come in dramatic blows. Sometimes it's in the small words, the steady pressure, the feeling of being erased piece by piece. Margaret had survived grief, loneliness, even widowhood, but this slow stripping away of her independence. felt like the cruelest cut. She looked around the kitchen, at the walls that had heard both laughter and tears, and she whispered to herself, maybe it's time to remind them what inheritance really means. Because inheritance wasn't just about property inheritance or wife inheritance or family secrets buried in legal documents. It was about love, sacrifice, loyalty. And if her family had forgotten that, then perhaps the hidden house on Lake Erie still had one last lesson to teach them. The first chill of autumn crept into Seattle, bringing with it the kind of rain that seemed to fall sideways, tapping against windows like impatient fingers. Margaret pulled her cardigan tighter as she stood by the glass, watching the gray sky blur into the street. She felt the weight of her decision pressing heavier. With each passing day, Rachel's words echoed still. Family loyalty means doing the right thing. But Margaret knew in her bones that family loyalty didn't mean surrendering every piece of herself. That night, she made up her mind. She picked up the phone and called David. I'm going back to Ohio for a week, she said gently. There was a pause. Ohio? Why now? David asked. I need to take care of something, Margaret replied, her voice steady. David didn't push. Perhaps he sensed it was something he couldn't control. Perhaps he was too tired of balancing the sharp edges between his wife and his mother. And so, a few days later, Margaret found herself standing once again at the edge of Lake Erie. The cabin came into view, just as weathered and stubborn as she remembered. Its wooden frame leaned slightly, like an old man unwilling to bow to time. The porch creaked beneath her step, and when she opened the door, the scent of pine and old books rushed out to greet her, wrapping her in a blanket of memory. Inside, dust motes floated in the beams of light, breaking through the shutters. The place looked untouched since her last visit years ago. Margaret set down her suitcase and walked slowly through each room, trailing her fingers along the worn furniture. Here, in this hidden house, she was more than a widow, more than a mother-in-law. She was herself. She lit the fireplace and sat down with a notebook. She began to write, not numbers, not deeds, not estate planning documents, but stories. Stories of her aunt who had left for this place, of summers by the lake, of the laughter that once filled these walls. If there was going to be an inheritance surprise for her family, she wanted it to be more than property. She wanted it to be a legacy. As the days passed, Margaret discovered more than memories. In the attic, tucked inside a cedar chest, she found old letters tied with fraying ribbon. They were addressed to her aunt from a man whose name Margaret didn't recognize. The words spoke of love, of longing, of plans to build a life that never came to be. Her aunt had been part of a secret romance, an inheritance of silence Margaret had never imagined. It hit her then. Every family carries estate secrets, stories tucked away in hidden corners, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Some were painful, some tender, but all of them part of the fabric that made a family real. One afternoon, as Margaret walked the shoreline, the lake stretching endlessly before her, she whispered into the wind, "This is what they don't understand. Inheritance isn't just money. It's memories, mistakes, choices. It's the courage to keep going." Back in Seattle, Rachel was not patient. She called David late one night, her voice sharp. "Do you know what your mother's doing out there? She's stalling. That cabin is a liability. If she doesn't include it in the family trust now, we'll all suffer later. It's selfish." David sighed, running his hands through his hair. "Rachel, maybe Mom just needs time. It's her place. She's the widow here. She's carried this alone. Can't we give her space?" But Rachel's silence on the other end said it all. She wasn't interested in space. She wanted control. Meanwhile, Margaret was finding something she hadn't felt in years. Strength. She rebuilt the porch railing with her own 2 hands, painted the shutters a fresh coat of white, even planted a row of marigolds by the front steps. Neighbors passing by smiled and waved, some remembering her from decades earlier. One evening, as the sun set over the water, she sat with her notebook and wrote the words that would later change everything. If this cabin is to be inherited, let it be with understanding, not with greed. Let it remind my family that property inheritance is not about control, but about connection. When the week ended, Margaret returned to Seattle, but she wasn't the same woman who had left. She carried with her not just the deed to the cabin, but the determination to show her family what inheritance really meant. The confrontation came sooner than she expected. Rachel met her at the door with arms crossed. "Did you bring the paperwork?" she asked, wasting no time. Margaret set down her bag. "No, I brought something better." Rachel's eyes narrowed, but before she could speak, David walked in, his children trailing behind him. Margaret smiled at them softly and held up the notebook she had filled at the cabin. "This," she said, "is what I want you to inherit. Stories, lessons, the truth about where we came from. The house on Lake Erie. It's not just a hidden asset. It's the soul of our family. And if you can't see that, then maybe you don't understand inheritance at all." The room fell silent. Rachel's lips tightened, but David's eyes softened. He looked at his mother, then at the children who clung to her side. For the first time in a long while, he seemed to see her not as a liability, not as a burden, but as the heart of their family. And Margaret knew, deep down, that the mountain was only getting steeper. The inheritance drama had only just begun. The weeks after Margaret returned from Ohio felt uneasy, like living in a house where the walls held their breath. The children were as joyful as ever, bounding to the living room with their laughter echoing off the walls. But underneath that innocence was a tension that even they seemed to sense. Rachel had not let go of her mission. She believed the hidden house on Lake Erie was not just a piece of sentimental history. It was a financial asset, a liability, unless folded neatly into the family trust. To her, property inheritance was about numbers, documents, estate planning. To Margaret, it was about dignity, legacy, and the right to keep one last piece of her life untouched by control. The confrontation arrived on a rainy Saturday afternoon. Margaret had baked an apple pie, the smell of cinnamon filling the kitchen like an invitation to warmth. She was setting it on the table when Rachel walked in, her voice tight. "We need to talk. Now." David followed, looking weary, holding a stack of papers. Margaret noticed the embossed letterhead of a law office at the top. Her stomach turned. Rachel placed the folder on the table and opened it with the precision of someone wielding a knife. "This is the estate plan," she said, tapping the page. "We've drafted everything, your accounts, the Seattle property, even the life insurance policies. All that's left is the cabin. If you sign here, it will be added to the family trust. It's the responsible thing to do." Margaret looked at the neat rows of words, the legal language so cold it could freeze her breath. She pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose and said softly, "And if I don't?" Rachel's voice sharpened. "Then you're leaving your grandchildren with a legal mess. Hidden assets create court battles. Do you want them fighting over your estate secrets when you're gone? Do you want them to remember you as someone who refused to think ahead?" David shifted uneasily. "Mom, maybe Rachel's right. Maybe it's better to get everything in order now. Avoid inheritance drama later." Margaret stared at her son, her heart aching. He sounded so much like his father in that moment, practical, cautious. But unlike his father, David seemed blind to betrayal quietly unfolding. "David," she said gently, "I gave you the money for this house. I stood by when you and Rachel built your life here. But the cabin, it isn't just an asset. It's part of me, and it's not up for negotiation." Rachel's eyes blazed. "So you're saying your pride is worth more than your family's future? That's selfish." The word cut like a knife. Selfish. For decades, Margaret had lived her life giving, her time, her money, her love. And now, because she wanted to keep one hidden house, one secret inheritance, she was selfish? The silence after that word was heavy. Margaret could hear the ticking of the kitchen clock, the rain tapping against the window, the soft shuffle of little feet upstairs. Finally, Margaret stood. Her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of generations. "You think inheritance is about property and trusts and signatures. But let me tell you what inheritance really is. It's teaching your child to ride a bike even when your back aches. It's baking bread for holidays no one thanks you for. It's holding your family together when grief threatens to break you apart. That cabin isn't about money. It's about belonging. It's about reminding my grandchildren that life is more than spreadsheets and signatures." David lowered his head, shame flickering in his eyes. Rachel, however, wasn't moved. She snapped the folder shut. Then don't say we didn't warn you when everything falls apart. She stormed out of the room, the papers clutched in her hand like weapons. David lingered for a moment, torn between two loyalties, the wife he had promised to build a future with, and the mother who had given him everything to begin that future. I just don't want fighting later, he whispered. Margaret reached out and touched his hand. There's already fighting now. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the shadows dancing on the walls. She thought of her aunt, of the letters she had found in the cabin's attic, of the love story that had remained hidden all those years. Family secrets don't always destroy us, she thought. Sometimes they teach us what matters most. She pulled her notebook closer and began to write again. Not just stories this time, but instructions. She wasn't afraid of death. She was afraid of being misunderstood. If the family wanted to state secrets, then she would give them the truth, on her terms. The next morning, Margaret gathered her grandchildren in the kitchen. She cut thick slices of apple pie and placed them on their plates. Their faces lit up, the innocence in their eyes washing away the bitterness of the night before. "My darlings," she said softly, "someday you'll hear adults talk about inheritance. They'll make it sound like money and property. But remember this. Inheritance is also the stories we carry, the places we keep alive, the love we pass down. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." The children nodded, perhaps not fully understanding, but sensing the weight of her words. And for the first time in weeks, Margaret felt a flicker of peace. But deep down, she knew the storm wasn't over. The confrontation had cracked the foundation of her family. The next step would decide everything, whether love or betrayal would define their legacy. And as she looked out the window at the rain lifting, a thought rose in her chest. The mountain is steeper now, but I've climbed harder paths before. It started with whispers. Margaret noticed small changes first. The way Rachel's tone grew sharper. The way David avoided her gaze when finances came up. The way the grandchildren seemed quieter when she entered the room after one of their parents' serious talks. She sensed something shifting beneath the surface, like the slow crack of ice before it breaks. One Tuesday afternoon, as Margaret returned from her walk, she found a letter tucked into her mailbox. It wasn't a bill nor a holiday card. It was from a law office in downtown Seattle, the same name she'd seen on the folder Rachel had once carried. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a polite but firm request, documentation regarding the cabin on Lake Erie, for the purpose of updating family trust records. Margaret's breath caught. She hadn't signed anything. She hadn't agreed to anything. Yet here it was, proof that her son and daughter-in-law were moving forward without her consent. That night, she confronted David. He sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone, his expression tense. "David," she said, holding the letter in her hand, "why am I getting legal requests about the cabin? Did you give them my information?" David swallowed hard. "Mom, listen. Rachel and I just thought it would be easier if we got things moving. The lawyer said—" "The lawyer said?" Margaret interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. "What about what I said? What about my wishes?" David looked torn, his shoulders slumping. "I just don't want to mess later. Probate, fights between the kids. You don't know how ugly inheritance drama can get." Margaret's heart ached. "Ugly? David, it's already ugly. You went behind my back. Do you realize what that feels like? After everything I've given, everything I've done, you treat me like a problem to solve." Before David could respond, Rachel appeared in the doorway. Her arms were crossed, her chin high. "We're not trying to hurt you, Margaret. We're protecting the family. Hidden assets cause trouble. If you really loved your grandchildren, you'd stop clinging to this fantasy of a hidden house and let us handle things." The word struck like lightning. If you really loved your grandchildren. Margaret's lips trembled, but she refused to let the tears fall. "You don't get to measure my love," she said, her voice shaking with controlled fury. "You don't know what it cost me to keep that cabin alive all these years. You don't know the sacrifices I made. And you certainly don't get to erase my life with a pen stroke." Rachel's eyes narrowed. "Then maybe the court will decide." Assets are assets, Margaret, whether you like it or not. The room went silent. Even David looked startled at Rachel's bluntness. For the first time, Margaret saw it clearly. This wasn't about protecting the family. It was about control, about seizing every piece of the legacy for themselves. Later that week, Margaret discovered just how deep the betrayal went. She received a call from a neighbor near the cabin. "Maggie, I thought you should know." The woman said kindly, "A real estate agent came by last weekend, asking about your property. Said they were evaluating it for a potential listing." Margaret's blood ran cold. She hadn't contacted any agents, which meant someone else had. Her worst fears were confirmed when she confronted Rachel again. Rachel didn't even deny it. "We just wanted to get an estimate," she said smoothly, "to understand the value of what we're dealing with. It's standard estate planning. Nothing personal. Nothing personal." The phrase echoed in Margaret's mind like a cruel joke. Her aunt's letters, the summers by the lake, the wooden porch she rebuilt with her own hands. How could they say it was nothing personal? That night, Margaret sat in her room, the notebook of stories on her lap. She turned the pages slowly, reading the words she had poured onto paper. Memories of love, of loss, of resilience. She realized then that the betrayal wasn't just about money. It was about being silenced, erased, reduced to numbers on a page. But Margaret was not ready to be erased. The next morning, she called her own lawyer, an old friend who had handled her late husband's estate years ago. They met in a quiet office lined with books. Margaret explained everything: the pressure, the letters, the attempted appraisal of her cabin. Her lawyer listened carefully, then leaned back in his chair. "Margaret, you have more power than you think. That cabin was inherited solely by you. It's your property, you're right. If they try to seize it without consent, they'll face serious consequences. But more than that, you can decide who truly inherits it. You can craft a will or even a family trust of your own, one that reflects your values, not theirs." For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt her lungs fill with air again. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't trapped. She still had the ability to shape her legacy. She walked out of that office with a plan. If her family wanted to play inheritance games, then she would show them what true inheritance meant. Not betrayal, not secrecy, but strength, love, and truth. That evening, when Rachel once again pressed her to sign documents, Margaret smiled faintly and said, "You may think you know everything, Rachel, but some estate secrets aren't meant for you to control. They're meant to be revealed in their own time." Rachel's glare was icy, but Margaret no longer flinched. She had faced betrayal, and she had survived worse. The battle was far from over, but Margaret now knew she was prepared, because the inheritance surprise waiting for her family wasn't the loss of a cabin. It was a lesson that legacy belongs to those who cherish it, not those who try to control it. The betrayal had left Margaret shaken, but not defeated. For nights, she lay awake in her bed, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the old mantel clock, and the echo of Rachel's words. Assets are assets, whether you like it or not. Each repetition stung, but each repetition also sharpened something inside her. She was tired of being treated like an obstacle. One morning, Margaret poured herself a cup of coffee and opened the notebook she had been writing in since her return from the cabin. She ran her hand across the pages filled with stories, recipes, and lessons. Her legacy was already here, ink on paper, heart on page. But now she needed to protect the physical inheritance, too. So she picked up the phone and called her lawyer again. "I want to create my own trust," she said. "One that ensures my wishes are respected. I don't want Rachel dictating my legacy." The lawyer chuckled softly. "That's the spirit, Margaret. We'll make sure your property inheritance reflects your values. We'll protect the cabin, the accounts, and even your personal belongings if you wish. This isn't about family betrayal anymore. It's about family loyalty to what really matters." Within days, Margaret was sitting in the lawyer's office, reviewing documents that put her firmly back in control. She decided that the Seattle house would, indeed, be placed in the broader family trust. David and Rachel could manage it as they wished. But the cabin by Lake Erie, that would be kept separate, placed into what the lawyer called a personal heritage trust. "It means," the lawyer explained, You can designate it specifically for your grandchildren or even for charitable purposes. It won't be touched by anyone who doesn't honor your intent." Margaret smiled. For the first time in months, she felt like she was breathing fresh air. This was her turning point. But while Margaret was regaining her footing, Rachel was not backing down. One Sunday afternoon, over dinner, Rachel brought up again. "We really need to finalize everything, Margaret," she said, her fork clinking against her plate. "The longer we delay, the worse it looks for the family." Margaret set her napkin down and met Rachel's gaze squarely. "It's already finalized." Rachel blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Margaret said evenly, "that I've created my own plan. The cabin is no longer your concern. It will not be part of the family trust you and David are building." David looked up, startled. "Mom, when—" "Recently," Margaret interrupted. "It's legal, binding, and mine. The hidden house is secured. No one can sell it behind my back. No one can use it as leverage. It will remain what was always meant to be, a place of memory and love." Rachel's face reddened. "You went behind our backs? After all we've done for you?" Margaret's laugh was soft, almost sad. "Behind your backs? Rachel, you had realtors snooping around my cabin. You had lawyers sending me letters without my consent. Don't talk to me about betrayal." For once, Rachel had no quick retort. The children, sensing the tension, excused themselves from the table, leaving the adults in silence. After dinner, David lingered as Rachel stormed upstairs. He sat across from his mother, his eyes heavy with conflict. "I don't know what to say," he murmured. Margaret reached across the table, her hand brushing his. "Say nothing, son. Just remember this. Inheritance isn't about control. It's about care. And one day, you'll understand why I did this." David nodded, his eyes moist. For a fleeting moment, the distance between them felt bridged, even if Rachel's shadow still loomed large. The following week, Margaret returned to the cabin to breathe. She unlocked the door, inhaling that familiar scent of pine and dust. She lit the fireplace and settled into her armchair, notebook in hand. She wrote a letter addressed not to David, not to Rachel, but to her grandchildren. "My dears," it began, "someday you may hear stories about inheritance drama, family betrayal, and estate secrets. But I want you to know the truth. Love cannot be measured in deeds or wills. This cabin is yours, not for its walls or land, but for the memories it holds. Promise me you will keep it alive, not as a property, but as a story." Tears blurred her eyes as she finished the letter. She tucked it carefully into the notebook, sealing it between pages of recipes and recollections. That night, as the lake shimmered under the moonlight, Margaret felt lighter than she had in years. She had reclaimed her agency, her story, her legacy. For so long, she had been climbing the mountain of grief, betrayal, and pressure. But now, she had reached a plateau, a place where strength met peace. The turning point wasn't just about protecting an inheritance surprise. It was about rediscovering her own worth, her own voice. And Margaret knew the next stage of the climb would test that resolve even more. For secrets have a way of surfacing, and one of her aunt's letters, still tucked in the attic, was about to spark revelations no one in the family was prepared for. The turning point had steadied Margaret's heart, but life has a way of testing even the strongest resolve. One crisp October morning, as leaves along the lake blazed with reds and golds, Margaret returned to the cabin for what she thought would be a quiet weekend. She planned to mend some curtains, bake a loaf of bread, and maybe finish another chapter in her notebook. But fate had left something waiting for her. Something buried not in the soil but in the walls of the house itself. She was dusting shelves in the attic when her hand brushed against a loose board. It shifted with a creak. Curious, Margaret knelt down and pried it open. Inside the hollow space was a weathered tin box, edges rusted, the kind people once used to store family deeds and valuables. Her pulse quickened. She carried the box to the table, sat down, and carefully lifted the lid. Inside lay bundles of letters tied with ribbon, a faded photograph of her aunt standing with a man Margaret had never seen before, and a deed, another deed. But this one wasn't for the cabin. It was for a parcel of land nearby, a second property no one in the family knew existed. Margaret's breath caught. A second house. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the letters. They revealed a story hidden for decades. Her aunt had fallen in love with a man who was already married. Their affair had been quiet but enduring. And when he passed away, he left her the secret parcel of land, tucked away under a different name. To avoid scandal, she kept it hidden, transferring it quietly through a local attorney. And when she died, she left only hints for Margaret to find. Now, decades later, those hints had become real. Margaret sat stunned, the words hidden assets echoing in her mind. This was more than an inheritance surprise. It was a revelation that could either deepen the family drama or heal it, depending on how it was told. That evening, Margaret lit a fire and sat in her rocking chair, the photograph in her hand. Her aunt's eyes, full of a secret joy, stared back at her. For the first time, Margaret understood why her aunt had fought so fiercely to protect the cabin. It wasn't just a property inheritance. It was the guardian of a love story, of a life lived in shadows yet cherished deeply. She whispered into a quiet room, "I won't let your story be erased." Back in Seattle, however, Rachel's persistence had only grown. She had been pressuring David daily, warning him that his mother was being reckless, that the longer they waited, the greater the risk of losing everything. When David visited his mother the following week, Margaret decided it was time to reveal the truth. Not just about the trust she created, but about the secrets she had uncovered. "Sit down, David," she said softly, motioning to the living room. She handed him the photograph and the bundle of letters. "I found these in the cabin." David frowned, reading the first page. As his eyes moved across the words, his face shifted from confusion to shock. "Mom, are you saying there's another property?" Margaret nodded. "Yes, your great-aunt left it hidden. It was part of her story, her love, her life. I only just discovered it." David leaned back, running a hand over his face. "Rachel is going to lose her mind. She already thinks you're hiding assets. Now this." Margaret reached across the table, her voice firm but tender. "This isn't about Rachel. It isn't even about you. It's about truth. Our family has been fractured by secrecy and betrayal. Maybe this inheritance drama, isn't a curse, but a chance to learn that stories matter more than signatures." David looked at her for a long time, eyes softening. "I don't know how to explain this to Rachel, but I get it now, Mom. I really do." For the first time in months, Margaret felt a bridge form between them. A fragile one, yes, but real. That night, alone in the cabin, Margaret penned another letter for her grandchildren. She described the second house, the family secrets, the way love can be complicated yet enduring. She wanted them to inherit not only the property, but the wisdom. That life is messy, but love, when true, is never wasted. She sealed the letter in the notebook with the others. As she did, she realized this wasn't just about her aunt's hidden house or her own widow inheritance. It was about confronting the estate's secrets that linger in every family and choosing whether to let them poison or heal. The mountain of her journey had reached another steep rise, but Margaret felt ready. She knew that soon Rachel would learn of the second property, and that revelation would ignite the fiercest storm yet. And yet, staring into the firelight, Margaret smiled faintly, because sometimes the very secrets meant to divide a family can become the seeds of its redemption. The day Rachel found out about the second property, the storm that Margaret had been bracing for finally broke. It happened on a chilly Sunday afternoon. David, unable to carry the weight of his mother's revelation alone, told Rachel about the letters, the deed, and the hidden house. Margaret didn't fault him. He was caught in an impossible position, torn between loyalty to his wife and love for his mother. But Rachel's reaction was volcanic. She's been hiding assets this whole time. Rachel exploded, pacing the living room, her heels clattering against the hardwood floor. First the cabin, now some mysterious second house? This is fraud, David. Pure fraud. Do you realize what this means for estate planning? For family trust? For our future? David rubbed his temples. It's not fraud. It was her inheritance. She only just discovered the second house herself. She's not hiding anything from you. She's protecting what's hers. Rachel stopped, her eyes flashing. What's hers? Don't you see? The moment she passes, it all becomes part of the family. And if she plays games with this, it'll tear us apart. David's voice dropped to a whisper. Maybe it's already tearing us apart. Later that week, Rachel insisted on confronting Margaret directly. The three of them sat at the old oak dining table, the letters indeed spread out like cards in a high-stakes game. Rachel leaned forward, her voice icy. Margaret, I don't know what fantasy you think you're living in, but you can't just pull hidden assets out of an attic and expect us to nod along. A second house? A secret deed? This is inheritance drama at its worst. Margaret, calm but resolute, met her gaze. It's not a fantasy. It's history. My aunt's history. She trusted me to carry it forward, not erase it, and I will honor that trust. Rachel scoffed. Honor? You're playing with fire. Property inheritance isn't a storybook. It's law. And when you start weaving family secrets into legal documents, you risk everything. Margaret folded her hands. No, Rachel. What risks everything is greed. What tears families apart isn't secrets. It's betrayal. My aunt kept the house hidden because she knew how people would react. She knew it would bring out the worst. And sadly, she was right. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the ticking of the wall clock. David shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the two women he loved most. Finally, Margaret spoke again, softer this time. Rachel, I know you think this is about money, about control, but it's not. It's about legacy. The cabin, the second house, even the letters, they're not just estate secrets. They're pieces of who we are. If all you see is dollar signs, then you'll miss the inheritance surprise that matters most. The lessons, the sacrifices, the love that built these walls. Rachel's lips tightened, but for the first time, her eyes flickered with uncertainty. She looked at David, expecting him to side with her. Instead, he said quietly, She's right, Rachel. This isn't just about us. It's bigger than us. Rachel slammed her hand on the table. So what? We just let her rewrite everything? We just let her decide who gets what? Margaret's voice, though steady, carried steel. Yes, because it's mine to decide. Widow inheritance isn't a negotiation. It's my right, my story, my choice. And I've already made arrangements. The cabin will go to the grandchildren, untouched. The second house will be held in trust, not for profit, but for preservation. You can fight it, Rachel, but the law is on my side. For once, Rachel was speechless. She pushed back her chair and stormed out, the slam of the door rattling the picture frames. David remained, shoulders slumped. I don't know how we come back from this, Mom. Margaret reached across the table, placing her hand over his. We come back with truth, with patience, with love. You'll see. That night, Margaret sat by her window, the moonlight spilling across her lap. She thought about the generations who would one day gather in the cabin, who might restore the second house and learn the story of her aunt's hidden love. She thought about the pain of betrayal, the sting of Rachel's words, the ache in her son's eyes. But she also thought about resilience, because every family carries secrets. Every inheritance is tangled with stories untold. And while estate planning might be written in ink, legacy is always written in heart. Margaret knew the reckoning wasn't truly over. There would be more arguments, more tension, perhaps even court filings. But she also knew that what survived wouldn't be Rachel's bitterness or David's hesitation. What survived would be the love that held her family together through decades of storms. And as the clock ticked past midnight, Margaret whispered to herself, This is my story to tell, and I will not let it end in betrayal. The weeks after the confrontation were some of the hardest Margaret had ever faced. Rachel barely spoke to her, and when she did, her words carried a frost sharp enough to cut glass. David, caught in the middle, tried to keep peace, but his shoulders carried the weight of a man torn in two. Margaret, however, did not retreat. She visited her lawyer again, solidified the personal heritage trust of the cabin, and filed the papers regarding the second house. The documents made it clear. These properties were not bargaining chips. They were living legacies. But even as she secured the legal side, her heart ached. She hadn't wanted her family to fracture over estate secrets and hidden assets. She hadn't wanted inheritance drama to steal Sunday dinners, or see her grandchildren whisper anxiously when Rachel left the room. One evening, Margaret invited David and the children to the cabin. Rachel declined the invitation, claiming she had errands, though Margaret knew the truth. Rachel was making a point. When David arrived with the kids, Margaret had the fireplace lit, a pot of chili simmering on the stove, and cornbread cooling on the counter. The cabin was warm, alive with the smell of smoke and spices. The children ran upstairs to play while David lingered by the fire, staring into the flames. "Mom," he said quietly, "I feel like we're drifting apart. Rachel doesn't trust you anymore. She says this inheritance surprise was a betrayal." Margaret set down her spoon and looked at her son, her voice steady but soft. "David, betrayal isn't protecting what was entrusted to me. Betrayal would be erasing your aunt's story. Betrayal would be selling off a cabin built with love just because it didn't fit someone's spreadsheet." David's eyes watered, though he tried to hide it. "I just wish it wasn't so complicated." Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's always complicated when love and property get tangled. That's why they call it inheritance drama. But listen to me. Someday, when I'm gone, you'll realize it wasn't about the second house or the cabin. It was about keeping the heart of our family alive." Later that night, when the children were asleep, Margaret pulled out her notebook and showed David the letters she'd written to the grandchildren. She read one aloud, her voice quivering. "My darlings, you will inherit stories as much as houses. One day, you may find yourself sitting at the same table, arguing over trust funds and deeds. But I beg you," pause, "remember that what we truly inherit from one another isn't land or money. It's loyalty, kindness, and courage. The rest is paper." When she finished, the room was quiet except for crackling fire. David wiped his eyes and whispered, "I think I finally understand, Mom." The following week, Margaret surprised everyone by inviting Rachel to tea at a local cafe. To her astonishment, Rachel agreed. They sat across from one another, the clink of cups filling the silence. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Margaret said, "Rachel, I know you feel wronged. I know you think I've hidden things from you. But the truth is, I've been protecting them. Not from you, but for the family." Rachel's jaw tightened. "And what about fairness? About planning for the future? Do you know how humiliating it is to think my husband's family is keeping secrets from me?" Margaret leaned forward. "Fairness isn't always equal shares. Sometimes fairness is honoring what was meant to endure. The cabin, the hidden house, they weren't just real estate. They were trust. And I won't be the one to break that trust." Rachel's eyes softened slightly, though suspicion still lingered. "And where does that leave us?" Margaret smiled faintly. "It leaves us with a choice. We can fight until we're strangers, or we can accept that inheritance doesn't have to divide us. We can build something new, through love, not just contracts." For the first time in months, Rachel didn't argue. She sipped her tea slowly, and though her silence wasn't surrender, it wasn't hostility either. It was something in between fragile but possible. That evening, Margaret returned to the cabin alone. She sat by the lake as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the water in hues of orange and purple. She thought about her aunt, about her husband who had died years ago, about the generations that would one day walk these shores. Her story, once filled with fear and betrayal, now felt like a tapestry. Yes, it had frayed edges and knots, but also had vibrant threads of resilience, loyalty, and love. She realized then that the resolution she sought wasn't about winning or losing. It was about peace. Peace with her choices. Peace with her family, even if that peace was imperfect. And as the autumn wind rustled through the trees, Margaret whispered to herself, "I've done what I can. The rest belongs to them." Winter came to the lake with quiet dignity. The trees stood bare, their branches etched against a silver sky. Snow dusted the cabin roof, and the world seemed hushed, as if pausing to listen to the heartbeat of the season. Margaret sat in her favorite rocking chair by the window, a knitted shawl draped around her shoulders, watching the flakes drift down. So much had changed since that first shocking moment when she discovered the will. She thought about the long road she had walked, the hidden letters, the inheritance drama, the betrayal, the secret second house. She thought about the estate's secrets she had uncovered and the heavy choices she had made. And yet, sitting there with her coffee warm in her hands, she felt something she hadn't in years: peace. The grandchildren had come the weekend before, their laughter filling the cabin. They built snowmen by the dock, their mittens damp, their noses red, their joy as boundless as the frozen lake itself. Watching them, Margaret realized her fight had been worth it. She hadn't preserved the cabin for herself. She had preserved it for them, for the memories they would carry long after she was gone. David, too, had softened. Though Rachel remained cautious, Margaret saw glimpses of hope. There were no more slammed doors or icy silences. Conversations were tentative, but they were conversations. And sometimes that was enough. Families, after all, are not perfect. They bend, they bruise, they break, and sometimes they heal. On Christmas Eve, Margaret lit a single candle in the cabin window, a tradition her aunt had started decades before. She placed the letters, now bundled neatly in a wooden box, beneath the tree. On top of the box, she taped a note. For the next generation, our true inheritance is love. That night, as the fire cracked and shadows danced on the walls, Margaret allowed herself to remember. She remembered her aunt's laughter, her husband's steady hand, the way the lake shimmered under the summer sun. She remembered the pain of betrayal, yes, but also the moment of loyalty that had surprised her, like David's quiet support or the way Rachel, despite her anger, still showed up when the children asked. And she realized something simple yet profound. Inheritance is never just about property. It is about values passed down, lessons carried forward, and love that outlives us. Hidden assets may cause conflict. Family secrets may stir drama, but what endures is the spirit with which we choose to handle them. The next morning, Margaret bundled herself in her coat and stepped outside. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she walked to the lake's edge. The air was sharp, the sky pale blue, and the water beneath the ice glistened like glass. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, not of desperation, but of gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, "for the story I was given, for the chance to protect it, for the love that remains." When she returned to the cabin, she felt lighter, as though the weight of generations had shifted from her shoulders to the sturdy beams of the house itself. Years from now, she knew, her grandchildren would gather here. They might argue over chores or laugh at old family photos, but they would also remember. They would remember the chili bubbling on the stove, the smell of cornbread cooling, the candle glowing in the window. They would remember that their grandmother had fought not for money, but for meaning. As the day drew to a close, Margaret picked up her pen and wrote one final entry in her notebook. "To my family, if you ever wonder why I held on so tightly, it was never for the cabin alone. It was for the stories written in its walls, for the love that built it, and for the hope that one day you'll sit here too, not as owners of property, but as keepers of legacy. That is your true inheritance." She closed the notebook, set it on the shelf, and smiled, because she knew, really knew, that her story, with all its twists of estate planning, family betrayal, hidden house, and inheritance surprise, had found its ending. Not a perfect ending, not a fairy tale, but a human one. And in the end, that was enough. And so, my dear friends, that is where the story rests. Not in the legal documents, not even in the bricks of the cabin or the hidden second house, but in the quiet truth that what we inherit from those before us is never just property. It is the laughter, the loyalty, the scars, and the wisdom that linger long after the walls fall silent. Perhaps you've lived your own inheritance drama, or perhaps you faced family betrayal that left wounds slow to heal. But know this, we all have a chance to choose love over greed, connection over division, and legacy over property. That is the real wealth we leave behind. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story touched you, share it with someone who may need to hear it. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you'll always find your seat here at the table. And don't forget, leave a comment with the number 1 to let me know you stayed with me all the way through. Until next time, my friends, May your days be warm, your family strong, and your legacy filled with love.